A young singer walked onto a national stage with nothing but a battered guitar and a dream. Seconds later, a single snapping string shattered everything, and the crowd laughed. But before his hope collapsed for good, one man silently stood up from the audience. No one knew what he would do next, or how it would change the show forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The studio of Voices of the Heart buzzed with the kind of charged excitement that only live television could create. Bright white spotlights swept across the audience in slow arcs, reflecting off polished camera lenses and rows of eager faces. Every seat was filled. Music fans, families, tourists, and people who simply wanted to witness something unforgettable sat shoulder to shoulder, speaking in hushed voices as they waited for the next contestant. The floor crew moved quickly, adjusting cables and microphones, trying to keep the broadcast right on schedule. The energy felt almost electric, but beneath the noise lived a quiet tension that always came before a performance. It was the kind of silence that made every viewer lean forward just a little more. Then came the introduction. A soft voice from backstage announced the name, Ethan Marquez. For a moment, nothing happened. The audience shifted, looking toward the curtain, as though expecting a confident, well-prepared performer to step forward. Instead, a thin, shy 19-year-old walked into the light, blinking at the sudden brightness. His shoulders rounded inward. His steps were light, almost hesitant, and in his hands he carried a cheap, weather-worn acoustic guitar that looked like it had survived years of wear. The edges were scuffed. One tuning peg was slightly bent. The strap was fraying. It was the kind of guitar that told a story before he ever played a note. Ethan approached the microphone with trembling hands. He wore a faded gray t-shirt tucked into old jeans that had lost their color from too many washes. His shoes were worn at the heels, the kind bought once and kept long after their prime. He looked like someone who had fought to be here, someone who had sacrificed much more than money or comfort. When he finally lifted his face toward the judges, his eyes flickered with a mix of fear and hope. He introduced himself so quietly that a few people in the back leaned forward instinctively, trying to catch the sound. Even the judges paused, realizing they were looking at a young man trying with everything he had to hold himself together. For a moment, the room softened. A polite curiosity passed through the audience. People wanted to give him a chance. They wanted him to succeed, but buried beneath that hopeful silence was the pressure of millions of watching eyes, and Ethan felt every single one of them. Ethan took one shaky breath and positioned his fingers on the fretboard. Under the harsh studio lights, his hands looked even more unsteady, the faint tremor visible to anyone watching closely. The judges leaned back in their chairs, preparing to evaluate whatever came next. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every nervous movement. Millions of viewers at home would later replay this moment without understanding the weight it carried for him. But right now in the studio, the atmosphere tightened as Ethan closed his eyes and gathered the courage to begin. The first strum rang out across the studio, a soft, fragile chord that carried a kind of innocence. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Conversations in the audience stopped. Even the crew members paused, surprised by the gentle tone coming from such an old instrument. For a split second, it felt like Ethan might find his footing, like he might steady himself long enough to deliver the performance he had dreamed of giving since he was a child. His fingers moved to the next position, ready for the second chord. His breath steadied. His shoulders relaxed just a little. Hope flickered in his chest. Then it happened. A sharp snapping sound tore through the room. The high E string of his guitar whipped upward violently, breaking with a piercing crack that echoed across the studio like a slap. Ethan's eyes flew open. His entire body froze. The room gasped in unison. The sound was unmistakable, a broken string, the moment every guitarist feared, and it had happened at the worst possible time. Silence lasted only a second before small pockets of laughter rippled through the seats. Someone in the audience covered their mouth, trying to hide a smirk. Another person whispered something to their friend who snorted loudly. A shaky exhale left Ethan's lips as his vision blurred. The judges exchanged looks they didn't bother to hide. One judge rubbed his temples as though this was inevitable. Another shook her head slowly, already preparing to move on to the next contestant. The disappointment on their faces cut deeper than any insult. Ethan stared down at his broken guitar, the string curled uselessly across the fretboard. His throat tightened, his hands trembled harder than before. A dream he had fought for a moment he had built toward, for years had shattered in front of strangers who were already giving up on him. The sting of humiliation spread through him, heavy and suffocating. The harsh lights above him felt hotter now, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. Ethan tried to swallow, but his throat felt locked tight with panic and embarrassment. He could hear whispers from the audience, the soft but unmistakable rustle of people leaning to their neighbor to comment on the failure unfolding on stage. The microphone picked up the slight hitch in his breathing, broadcasting his fear across every speaker in the room. He lowered his gaze, unable to look at the judges, unable to look at the crowd. Humiliation spread across his chest like a slow-burning fire. The show's host stood off to the side, frozen in an uncomfortable half-smile, clearly unsure whether to step in or let the moment sink. One of the judges lifted a hand toward her microphone, ready to gently dismiss him and move on. Her eyes held sympathy, but there was finality in them too, as if the outcome had already been decided. Another judge leaned back in his chair with an expression that said, without words, "I knew this would happen." And the third judge sighed loudly, not even bothering to hide his frustration. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every painful second. Ethan's eyes filled with tears he tried desperately to hold back. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, soft, encouraging, always proud. She used to tell him his music mattered, that his heart showed in every note he played. But those memories felt distant, now drowned under the weight of the crowd's reaction. He felt small. He felt foolish for believing he belonged on a stage like this, surrounded by polished performers with perfect instruments. His grip tightened around the broken guitar, the rough wood digging into his palms. He whispered an apology into the microphone, barely audible, the word trembling out of him like a final plea. And then something shifted. Not in the lights, not in the sound, but in the room itself. From the far corner of the studio, a figure moved, quiet, steady, almost unnoticed. A man sitting without fanfare in a dark jacket lifted his head. His eyes focused on the young performer standing alone on the stage. While the crowd judged, laughed, or dismissed, Keanu Reeves saw something else. He saw a dream collapsing in real time. And in that moment, he made a choice that would change everything that followed. Long before Ethan Marquez stepped under the blinding lights of Voices of the Heart, his world had been shaped by quiet struggles no one in the audience could have imagined. He grew up behind a small laundromat in a cramped, rented room that always smelled faintly of detergent and steam. His mother, Elena, worked double shifts every week just to keep the two of them afloat. Ethan remembered falling asleep on nights when she didn't get home until dawn, her exhausted footsteps shuffling across the small room as she tried not to wake him. Their life was simple and often hard, but she always made sure he felt loved. When she had a few minutes to rest, she would smile and tell him that one day he would do something beautiful in the world. Music entered his life the day he found a battered acoustic guitar at a church donation table. It was missing a string covered in scratches and too small for an adult hand, but to Ethan it looked like a miracle. No one else wanted it. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't valuable, but it was his. He brought it home with the excitement of someone who had found treasure. His mother laughed softly when she saw it, saying it looked like it had already lived 2 lifetimes, but she never discouraged him. Instead, she sat on the edge of their old mattress and listened as he plucked awkward notes, practicing until his fingertips burned. With no money for lessons, Ethan taught himself through little pieces of sound. He watched street performers downtown memorizing their hand positions. He borrowed old music books from the library and studied them late at night when the laundromat was finally quiet. Music became his escape, the one place where he didn't feel invisible. When kids at school mocked his worn-out clothes or the way he talked softly, he would rush home, pick up his guitar, and let the strings remind him that he mattered. His mother would close her eyes and listen, her face softening with pride, even on days when she was too tired to stand straight. But when Ethan was 18, everything changed. His mother fell ill with an infection that spread fast, harder than her body could fight. She tried to keep working, tried to pretend she was fine, but the hospital bills rose quickly. They had no savings, no insurance. By the time she collapsed at work, it was too late. Her passing left Ethan standing alone in a world that suddenly felt colder than ever. After his mother passed, the laundromat owners allowed Ethan to keep the tiny room for a few more months out of sympathy, but without her income, every day felt like a countdown. He searched for jobs, anything that would keep him afloat, but he had no experience and no one to guide him. The world moved fast, and he felt left behind. On his darkest nights, he would sit on the floor with his guitar pressed to his chest, playing the melodies his mother used to love. They were quiet, shaky renditions, but they held him together when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Eventually, with bills piling higher than he could manage, Ethan began playing on street corners. It wasn't glamorous. Some days people walked by without even glancing at him. Other days, children stopped to listen while their parents dropped a few coins into his open guitar case. When someone complimented his voice, he carried that warmth with him for days. When someone insulted him or mocked his appearance, the words lingered even longer. Still, he kept playing. Music gave him a reason to get up, a reason to keep breathing through the grief that still washed over him like waves. Despite everything, Ethan never chased fame. His dream was smaller, more personal. He wanted to prove he wasn't worthless. He wanted to stand on a stage just once, long enough to show the world the talent his mother believed in. He wanted to feel like his life still had purpose, even without her. So when he overheard two travelers talking about a nationwide talent show audition rolling through the city, his heart sparked with something he hadn't felt in months: hope. He checked the poster outside the community center the next morning. The audition date was circled in bright red. He hesitated reading it 3 times before accepting the truth. If he didn't try now, he might never get another chance. He began saving every dollar he could from street performances and odd jobs, sometimes skipping meals to stretch the money further. After 3 months of scraping by, he finally had enough for a bus ticket to the audition city. Holding the ticket felt like holding the first step of a future he barely dared to imagine. But even with all that effort, even with all that hope, he still carried fear with him. He carried loneliness. He carried the weight of every failure he'd ever lived through. And as he entered the studio of Voices of the Heart, he felt all of it pressing against his ribs. The broken guitar string was more than an accident. It felt like the universe trying to remind him exactly who he was. As Ethan stood on that stage, watching the snapped guitar string curl like a taunt across the fretboard, every hardship he had endured seemed to gather around him at once. He felt the sting of the days he had played music in the cold just to earn enough for a sandwich. He felt the emptiness of waking in the small room behind the laundromat, reaching for his mother, only to remember she was gone. He felt the shame of being overlooked, dismissed, or treated like he didn't belong anywhere. And now, here he was in front of cameras, judges, and a live audience hearing laughter at the exact moment he had tried to reach for something better. He lowered his head, trying to steady his breathing, but the pressure only grew heavier. The stage lights sharpened every insecurity. The murmurs from the audience cut deeper than they were meant to. He could practically hear his mother whispering to be brave, but he struggled to hold on to her voice through the noise around him. The judges' disappointed expressions only deepened his panic. One glance at their faces made him feel like he had already failed, like whatever tiny hope he carried didn't matter anymore. And yet something inside him stubbornly refused to collapse completely. It was small, quiet, and fragile, but still present. The reason he came, the reason he saved for months, the reason he walked into the studio, even though fear nearly made him turn around at the door. Ethan didn't want fame. He wanted to be worthy of the belief his mother gave him. He wanted to remember he still had a future. that he wasn't invisible, that he wasn't broken beyond repair. But as the audience continued whispering and as a judge leaned toward her microphone to speak, Ethan felt his throat close. The humiliation wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. The dream he had guarded so carefully was slipping through his fingers. He whispered an apology, his voice trembling, unable to hide the defeat in his tone. And that was the moment Keanu Reeves lifted his head from the far corner of the studio. While the crowd saw a failed performance, Keanu saw a young man drowning in familiar loneliness. He understood that expression, that quiet breaking point. It was the look of someone who had been carrying too much for too long. And Keanu knew he couldn't sit still any longer. Keanu Reeves sat in one of the middle rows of the studio, dressed in a simple dark jacket and black t-shirt, the kind of outfit that allowed him to blend into the crowd rather than stand out. He kept his posture relaxed, his hands resting quietly in his lap, doing everything he could to avoid drawing attention. He wasn't here as a celebrity, and he wasn't interested in any spotlight. He had come only because his longtime friend, Michael Torres, the director of Voices of the Heart, had personally invited him to watch the finale taping. Michael had always believed that real talent could be found in the everyday stories of working families, young dreamers, and people who had survived hardship. Keanu respected that deeply. Supporting his friend mattered to him far more than any publicity. For most of the evening, Keanu watched the performances with quiet appreciation. Some contestants were polished, ready for the stage. Others were raw, but full of heart. He liked the raw ones most. They reminded him of the artists he met in his early acting days, people who poured everything into their craft because it was the only thing they truly owned. Keanu understood that kind of hunger, that kind of vulnerability. It was why he agreed to come, even though he usually avoided events in crowded studios. He enjoyed watching people chase something that mattered to them. But the moment Ethan Marquez stepped under the lights, Keanu felt the shift. The boy's posture, the trembling hands, the cautious voice. All of it told a story long before he even played a note. Keanu recognized the look of someone who didn't feel they deserved to be seen. Someone carrying grief and hope in equal measure. Someone standing on a stage, not for fame, but for something much deeper. He leaned forward slightly, instinctively paying closer attention. And when the guitar string snapped, Keanu's heart sank. The sharp crack echoed across the room, followed by laughter that burned harsher than the sound itself. Keanu's jaw tightened. He had never liked watching someone get publicly embarrassed, especially when they were already fighting their own private battles just to stand there. As the mood in the room shifted from anticipation to cruelty, Keanu felt a familiar discomfort rise in him. He had seen this kind of ridicule before. He had lived it. And something inside him refused to sit by and watch it happen again. Keanu kept his eyes on Ethan even as the room reacted harshly. The laughter from the audience made his shoulders stiffen, but what struck him even harder was the boy's expression. Ethan's face didn't reflect embarrassment alone. It showed a deeper pain, the kind that came from years of feeling overlooked. Keanu recognized that expression instantly. It was the same one he had seen in the mirror when he first started auditioning in Hollywood, when directors dismissed him because of his soft voice or unusual pauses. Some had mocked him openly. Others simply waved him away. He knew exactly what it felt like to stand in front of others and watch them decide you weren't enough. Michael Torres watched the scene unfold from the production desk, stress etched across his face. He exchanged whispers with the producers beside him, all of them scrambling to figure out whether to cut to commercial or quietly remove Ethan from the stage before things grew more uncomfortable. Timing mattered in live television, and a broken guitar string was a nightmare they hadn't planned for. Keanu saw Michael run a hand through his hair, overwhelmed by how quickly the mood was spiraling out of control. It wasn't anger Michael felt, it was frustration. He had built the show to highlight genuine talent, not to let humiliation go unchecked. But while the producers focused on the schedule, Keanu focused on Ethan's shaking hands. The boy clutched the damaged guitar so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His whole body trembled as he fought to hold himself together. Keanu could see the panic rising in him, the same kind that once made his own chest tighten when he felt trapped in front of strangers. And that was when something shifted inside him. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was quiet, steady, and deeply human. There was no moment of indecision, no weighing of consequences. Keanu simply felt a protective instinct rise, an urge to stop the downward spiral before it damaged the boy's spirit beyond repair. He didn't think about cameras or headlines or what people might say. He thought only about the young man who had worked so hard just to stand on that stage. Ethan looked like someone who had learned to carry his pain alone. Keanu understood that kind of loneliness, and he wasn't about to let this moment break him. The producers continued whispering urgently, already preparing to cue the host to end the performance early. A stagehand moved closer, waiting for the signal to escort Ethan off quietly, so the program could stay on track. But Keanu barely noticed the movement around him. His focus stayed locked on the young man, who now looked like he might collapse under the pressure. Ethan's eyes darted around, searching for some anchor, but finding none. His breath came too fast. His shoulders shook. He whispered something that didn't reach the microphone. And in that moment, Keanu felt a pull inside him, stronger than anything else in the room. He understood exactly what Ethan was fighting. The fear of failure. The fear of being laughed at after trying so hard. The fear of disappointing someone who once believed in you. These were emotions Keanu knew intimately, and he had spent years learning to rise above them. But Ethan was still just a kid, standing alone in the harshest spotlight of his life, battling ghosts no one else could see. Keanu remembered feeling that small once, that unsure, that desperate for anyone to step in and show a little compassion. Michael glanced out into the audience and caught sight of Keanu. Their eyes met for just a second. Michael didn't know what Keanu was planning, but he could see something determined in his friend's expression, something protective and unshakable. Michael didn't signal him to stop. He didn't shake his head or try to redirect the moment. Instead, he gave the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement that whatever Keanu was thinking, Michael trusted him. He always had. Even so, Keanu didn't move immediately. He took a slow breath, letting the tension settle inside him. He knew the weight of stepping into a live moment like this, but he also knew that if he did nothing, Ethan's spirit might crack in a way that could take years to recover from. That was something Keanu couldn't accept. It went against everything he believed in, everything he had learned about kindness and second chances. Then Ethan's lip trembled. His shoulders sank, and that was it. The moment, Keanu's hesitation dissolved completely. He pushed himself up from his seat, not with urgency or heroism, but with quiet resolve. He rose because someone needed him, because a young man's dream was slipping away in front of millions, because Keanu had always believed that standing up for someone at their lowest was one of the most important things a person could do. And so, in a studio full of noise, lights, and uncertainty, Keanu Reeves stood. Ethan tried to force out a few words, but the sound that left his throat barely carried past the microphone. His voice cracked instantly, trembling under the pressure. The judges leaned forward, their faces shifting from polite interest to uncomfortable impatience. One judge, a woman known for her kinder critiques, leaned toward her microphone and attempted to soften the blow. She told him gently that maybe he could come back next year, her tone suggesting that leaving now might save him from further embarrassment. But even her kindness felt like a dismissal. It was still an invitation to walk away, an implication that he wasn't ready, that he wasn't enough. Before Ethan could respond, another judge let out a loud, theatrical sigh into his microphone. The sound echoed across the studio, dramatic and exaggerated, clearly signaling annoyance. A few audience members laughed at the gesture, and that laughter spread quickly, like a spark hitting dry grass. Ethan flinched at the reaction. The judge's sigh wasn't meant to hurt him directly, but it did. It amplified the feeling that he had already failed before he had even begun. The laughter stung worse than the broken string. At least the string didn't choose to snap. People chose to laugh. Then someone in the front row lifted their hands and mockingly trembled them in the air, exaggerating Ethan's shaking. A couple of teenagers nearby burst into loud laughter, nudging each other with elbows, as though this were all some kind of comedy act. The cruelty cut deeper, because Ethan saw it. His gaze caught the imitation for a split second, and his heart dropped. All he wanted was one chance, a single moment to prove he belonged on this stage. Instead, he was becoming the punchline of a hurtful joke. The camera zoomed in, capturing every detail of Ethan's unraveling. His eyes filled with tears, he tried desperately to blink away. His shoulders collapsed inward, shrinking, as though he wished he could disappear. His throat tightened until breathing felt like swallowing glass. The crowd, eager for entertainment, forgot entirely that he was a real person with a real story, standing alone in one of the most vulnerable moments of his life. The producers behind the scenes whispered excitedly, already preparing this moment as a viral fail clip that would rake in millions of views. All Ethan felt was the world closing in on him. Ethan lowered his gaze to the broken guitar string, staring at it as if it were the final proof that he didn't belong on any stage. The thin metal coil hung uselessly across the fretboard, mocking everything he had worked for. To others, it was just an unfortunate accident. To Ethan, it felt like the world telling him he should never have tried in the first place. His chest tightened painfully. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but even the simple act of breathing felt impossible under the weight of so many eyes judging him at once. His mother's voice flickered through his mind, soft and warm, telling him years ago not to give up on something he loved. She used to squeeze his shoulders and whisper that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but choosing to keep going anyway. He tried to hold on to that memory, tried to let her strength ground him, but grief pressed in harder than the memory could soothe. She wasn't here to tell him he could do this. She wasn't here to remind him his voice mattered. And without her, the stage felt bigger, the lights harsher, the audience more unforgiving. The host shifted uncomfortably to the side of the stage, unsure whether to step forward and end the moment or let the judges handle it. Cameras kept rolling because the tension made for gripping television. Producers behind the control desk exchanged excited whispers about views, clicks, and reactions. To them, this was drama. To Ethan, this was devastation. No one spoke up for him. No one told the audience to stop laughing. No one said the situation could be fixed. He was alone in a room filled with people. The pressure built in his throat until he could no longer hold back the words rising inside him. He stepped closer to the microphone, but the only thing he managed to whisper was an apology. It slipped out, broken, barely audible, like a confession of failure. The studio fell silent again, not out of sympathy, but out of expectation, waiting for him to walk away. Ethan blinked hard as a single tear slipped down his cheek, catching the stage light before it fell. And then, from somewhere in the audience, a chair scraped softly against the floor. Ethan didn't look up yet, but many others did, because someone quietly, steadily was standing. The soft scrape of the chair drew a ripple of curiosity through the studio, subtle at first, but growing quickly as more people turned their heads. The judges paused mid-sentence, surprised by the unexpected movement in the audience. Even the host hesitated, sensing that something had shifted in the room. Ethan kept his head lowered, so trapped in humiliation that he didn't register the change around him. He still stared at the broken string, still heard faint echoes of laughter, still felt the crushing weight of disappointment pressing into his spine. But from the middle rows, a figure rose slowly, calmly. Keanu Reeves stood with a steadiness that contrasted the chaos unfolding on stage. He didn't wave. He didn't call attention to himself. He simply stood upright, his expression unreadable, but filled with quiet purpose. The studio lighting caught his silhouette just enough for the first few audience members to recognize him, and whispers began to spread like a warm breeze, moving over cold ground. Somebody nudged their friend. Someone else gasped softly. A few people instinctively reached for their phones, unsure whether they were witnessing a planned moment or something entirely unexpected. But nothing about Keanu's stance suggested performance. He wasn't smiling for cameras, and he wasn't grandstanding. He was watching Ethan with a gentle, concerned focus, seeing the broken spirit that everyone else had ignored. Michael Torres, seated behind the production desk, froze for a moment when he realized who had stood up. He had invited Keanu to watch the finale, but he never expected him to step into the show itself. Still, when Keanu lifted his chin slightly, Michael didn't signal for security or shake his head. He let the moment breathe. He trusted Keanu enough to know that if he was standing, it was for a reason that mattered. The audience quieted on its own curiosity, gradually replacing ridicule. Even the teenagers who had laughed earlier fell silent, sensing something different was happening. The judges turned toward the direction of the commotion, their confusion shifting into recognition as they spotted Keanu. One judge whispered under his breath, stunned, wondering if the production team had arranged a celebrity moment. They hadn't. Ethan finally lifted his eyes, noticing the sudden hush. The room felt different, warmer somehow, as though someone had opened a door to let fresh air into a suffocating space. His gaze followed the silent attention of the crowd until it landed on the one person he never expected to see. Keanu Reeves stood there watching him with compassion instead of judgment. Ethan's breath caught, unsure what this meant, unsure whether he was more embarrassed or relieved. But the moment Keanu took his first quiet step toward the stage, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since the string snapped. He felt the first hint of hope. A low murmur swept through the studio the moment Keanu Reeves took his first step forward. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was the kind of ripple that moved through people slowly, like a wave of recognition spreading from one row to the next. Some audience members gasped quietly. Others squinted, unsure whether their eyes were tricking them. A few whispered his name with disbelief, and each whisper only fed the growing awareness in the room. Within seconds, the entire energy shifted from ridicule to stunned curiosity. The camera operators reacted instantly, swinging their lenses toward the unexpected commotion in the middle row. One of the camera feeds zoomed in, confirming the impossible. Michael Torres, the show's director, froze in place behind the production table the moment he saw who was standing. He stared at the monitor, eyes widening, his breath catching. He hadn't asked Keanu to participate in the show. There was no planned cameo, no staged moment. Whatever was happening was real, unscripted, and completely led by Keanu's own instinct. Keanu raised one hand politely, not to wave or gesture dramatically, but to acknowledge the crowd in a soft, respectful way. His voice carried calmly across the studio microphones. "Excuse me, may I borrow the stage for a moment?" The words were gentle, almost understated, but they cut through the noise with surprising power. The entire studio fell silent. The judges stopped mid-breath, eyebrows lifting in confusion. Even the teenagers in the front row who had mocked Ethan earlier sat frozen, their expressions shifting from amusement to shock. Security guards didn't move because they recognized him instantly. There was no reason to question his approach, no need for clearance or verification. It was Keanu Reeves, someone known for humility, not disruption. He walked toward the stage steps with a calm, steady pace, his expression soft rather than dramatic. He didn't carry the energy of a celebrity entering the spotlight. He carried the presence of a kind man stepping into a moment that needed him. Ethan watched with wide, terrified eyes. His mind couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. His chest tightened for a completely different reason now. Confusion mixed with disbelief as he saw Keanu Reeves of all people approaching the stage with a reassuring smile. And for the first time since the string snapped, the room felt different. Not safe, but no longer cruel. It felt like light was beginning to return. Keanu stepped onto the first stair leading to the stage, moving with a quiet confidence that immediately softened the atmosphere. He didn't stride with authority or sweep his arms dramatically. Instead, he walked like someone approaching a frightened animal, careful and gentle, aware that any sudden movement could send Ethan deeper into panic. As he reached the top of the stairs, he paused just a moment, giving Ethan time to see him clearly and understand that he wasn't a threat. He was here to help. The judges exchanged glances, still trying to grasp what was unfolding in front of them. One of them opened her mouth to speak, then decided against it. This wasn't the time to question or interrupt. Something about Keanu's presence made it impossible to treat the situation like normal television. Even the host, who relied on the cue cards and timing cues of live broadcast, stood perfectly still. It was as if the whole studio collectively understood that whatever was happening transcended the show itself. Ethan clutched his broken guitar, unsure whether he should step back, apologize again, or try to speak. His heart pounded so violently that he wondered if the microphones could pick up the sound. When Keanu approached him with that soft, reassuring smile, Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. It didn't make sense. Why was someone like Keanu Reeves walking toward him? Why would someone so respected, so admired, intervene in a moment like this? Keanu stopped a few steps away and offered a small nod, a gesture of understanding that felt far more comforting than words. "Looks like you need a working guitar," he said softly. The sentence was simple, straightforward, but the kindness threaded through it filled the room like warm light breaking through clouds. It erased for a moment the laughter that had lingered in the air. It eased the tension on Ethan's shoulders more than any apology or reassurance could. A heavy silence fell across the studio, not cold, not judging, but stunned. People didn't know how to react. They had never seen anything like this. Michael Torres watched from the production booth, his chest tightening with emotion. He had always admired Keanu for his humility, but watching him step in to protect a young man on national television made him see his friend in a new light. Keanu turned toward the backstage crew and asked calmly if they had a spare guitar. The request was polite and unforced, as if he were simply borrowing a tool from a friend. And in that one small moment, the entire energy of the show shifted. The cruelty faded. The mockery died. Hope began to take its place. A stagehand blinked in disbelief before scrambling backstage to look for a spare guitar. The crew moved with a mixture of confusion and urgency, unsure whether they were supporting a celebrity moment or something much more meaningful. While they searched, Keanu remained beside Ethan, not touching him, not overwhelming him, but grounding the space with a calm presence that Ethan could feel even through the haze of panic. It was the way Keanu stood steady, gentle, patient, that helped Ethan draw his first full breath since the string snapped. The audience watched in silence, completely enthralled. Moments earlier, the room had been filled with laughter and judgment. Now everyone sat forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the man who had chosen compassion over spectacle. A few audience members lowered their heads in shame, suddenly aware of how quickly they had joined in the ridicule. Others looked at Ethan differently, seeing not a failure but a young man who must have worked incredibly hard just to be here. When the stagehand returned with a spare guitar, it wasn't impressive. It was dusty, slightly out of tune, clearly not something the show used often. But Keanu accepted it with gratitude, nodding kindly before kneeling near one of the stage monitors. His movements were steady, almost careful, as he checked each string and turned each peg with practiced familiarity. Ethan watched, still frozen in disbelief. He had grown up admiring Keanu from afar, hearing stories of how kind he was in real life, but seeing it firsthand was something entirely different. He wasn't watching a movie star. He was watching a human being choosing kindness when it mattered. Keanu finished tuning the guitar and stood giving it a final, soft strum before offering it to Ethan. But he didn't push it into the boy's hands. He held it out gently, inviting, rather than insisting. Ethan hesitated, staring at the instrument through blurry eyes. His hands trembled when he finally reached for it, and Keanu steadied the moment with a quiet nod. "It's okay," Keanu murmured. "Take your time." Those words broke through the last of Ethan's fear. They weren't loud. They weren't meant for the cameras. They were meant for him alone. And in the stunned silence of the studio, something changed. A moment that had begun in humiliation was transforming into something fragile and hopeful. The crowd felt it. The judges felt it. Ethan felt it. And as Keanu stepped back to give him room, the entire world waited to see what would happen next. The spare acoustic guitar arrived in the arms of a breathless stagehand who looked as stunned as everyone else in the room. The instrument was slightly dusty, the kind of guitar kept backstage for emergencies but rarely touched. The wood had lost some of its shine, and the strings looked uneven from disuse. Still, Keanu accepted it with a nod that made the stagehand straighten with unexpected pride. Keanu handled the instrument with the quiet reverence of someone who understood what music meant to a frightened young performer. He didn't rush. He didn't act for the cameras. He simply knelt beside the stage monitors, settling into a position that felt natural and grounded. The camera zoomed in, automatically drawn, not by spectacle, but by the tenderness of the moment. Keanu ran his fingers gently across each string, plucking one note at a time. The soft, uneven tones filled the studio. He listened carefully, tilting his head slightly as he adjusted the tuning pegs with precise, practiced motions. Each movement was deliberate, calm, almost meditative. A few audience members whispered in awe, realizing that Keanu wasn't doing this for applause. He was genuinely helping the way someone would help a friend in need, rather than a stranger on a national stage. Ethan stood frozen, holding the remains of his own broken guitar against his chest. He watched Keanu work with a feeling that tangled disbelief with gratitude. It didn't seem real. This was the kind of kindness he had only imagined in stories, not something he ever expected to experience in the middle of his most humiliating moment. He didn't know whether to cry, step back, or apologize again. His hands felt weak, his pulse racing too fast to steady. But he couldn't look away. Keanu's presence created a pocket of stillness in the chaos, a moment where the noise of judgment softened into something almost peaceful. When Keanu finished tuning, he strummed a clean chord. The sound rang smooth and warm, a stark contrast to the shaky note Ethan had begun with. Keanu rose slowly and approached him, holding out the guitar with a gentle expression. But Ethan's hands trembled so violently that he couldn't grip it. His fingers curled inward, refusing to cooperate. Shame flushed over him, and he looked down as though expecting disappointment. Instead, Keanu placed a steady hand on his shoulder, firm enough to ground him, soft enough to reassure him he wasn't alone. It was a simple touch, but it carried more comfort than words ever could. Ethan inhaled shakily, finally able to draw a full breath. Ethan tried again to take the guitar, but his fingers wouldn't stop trembling. The pressure of the moment, the lingering humiliation, and the overwhelming shock of standing beside Keanu Reeves all mixed inside him until his body refused to cooperate. His fingertips hovered above the strings without making contact. His palms felt damp, and he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He wanted to be strong. He wanted to show he deserved this chance. But fear wouldn't relent. It clung to him, tightening around his ribcage like a band he couldn't break. Keanu noticed immediately. He didn't hurry him. He didn't tell him to calm down. Instead, he stepped just a little closer, creating a shield of quiet around them. With a gentle grounding presence, he lowered the guitar slightly and kept a hand on Ethan's shoulder. The warmth of that touch cut through the rising panic like a slow, steady heartbeat. Keanu didn't speak yet. He simply stood there, letting Ethan borrow his steadiness until the shaking in Ethan's hands began to slow. The judges watched in complete silence. A few minutes earlier, they had been prepared to dismiss Ethan with polite disappointment. Now their expressions shifted into something deeper: humility, regret, even admiration. They had never seen a contestant rescued in this way. They had never witnessed a moment where someone stepped in not to perform, but to protect. One judge's eyes softened as she watched Ethan struggle to breathe. Another leaned back, clearly reflecting on how easily he had allowed himself to judge the boy before hearing a single line from his song. The audience was equally transformed. The mocking atmosphere had dissolved completely. Viewers who once laughed now held their breath, witnessing a moment far more human than anything the show had intended. A few people in the back row wiped tears from their eyes. Others leaned forward, compelled by the sincerity radiating from the connection forming on stage. The cameras captured all of it: the trembling hands, the steady grounding, the compassion in Keanu's eyes. But for once, no one cared about the broadcast. They cared about the boy shaking in front of them, the boy who still hadn't given up. Keanu glanced at Ethan again, waiting for the smallest signal that he was ready. Ethan breathed in, shaky, but fuller than before. He loosened his grip on his broken guitar and let it rest against his leg. His fingers hovered toward the spare guitar a second time. The trembling wasn't gone, but it was no longer overwhelming him. Keanu lifted the microphone with his free hand. His voice came out calm, steady, and impossibly warm. "You don't have to do this alone." The words reached Ethan like a lifeline. They settled into the quiet places of his heart, giving him strength he didn't know he still had. Ethan stared at Keanu, the words echoing through him with a force he hadn't expected. For so long he had fought alone against poverty, against grief, against the belief that his dreams were too fragile to survive the world. Hearing someone say he didn't have to carry everything by himself sent a new kind of emotion flooding through him. His throat tightened, but this time it wasn't from panic. It was from the overwhelming relief of being seen. Keanu lowered the microphone and held out the guitar again, patient and steady. Ethan reached for it with trembling hands. His fingers brushed the smooth wooden surface. He paused, afraid he might drop it, but Keanu shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself close enough to steady the moment without taking control away. Ethan felt that support like a quiet anchor. He adjusted his grip and finally lifted the guitar into his arms. It wasn't perfect. His hands still shook, but he held it. The audience let out a soft, collective exhale, as if everyone had been holding their breath at the same time. The judges, humbled by what they were witnessing, watched with newfound respect. The earlier cruelty felt distant now, overshadowed by the weight of this small, powerful act of kindness unfolding before them. Even the stage crew, who had seen countless performances and breakdowns over the years, stood still, captivated by the sincerity on stage. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. He wasn't ready to sing yet. His body needed more time, more reassurance, more grounding. Keanu sensed it immediately. He stepped closer, but not in front of him. He didn't take the spotlight. He didn't guide the moment with commands or instructions. Instead, he spoke softly, his tone gentle enough to settle the air around them. "Take a breath," Keanu murmured. "You're okay." Ethan inhaled slowly, his lungs expanding as the tightness around his chest loosened. The microphone picked up the small hitch in his breath, but this time no one laughed. The empathy in the room was palpable. Everyone understood, perhaps for the first time, the bravery it took for a young man with nothing but a battered past to stand on that stage at all. Keanu gave him another small nod, offering reassurance without pressure. The soft lights overhead reflected off the polished surface of the now tuned guitar. For the first time since the moment the string snapped, Ethan began to believe that maybe this night didn't have to end in ruin. With Keanu standing beside him, steady, patient, and quietly protective, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since he first walked onto the stage. He felt the chance to begin again. Ethan tried to steady the guitar against his body, but the moment he shifted his fingers into position, the panic he thought he had managed to control surged back with full force. His chest tightened sharply, as though an invisible band wrapped around his ribs and squeezed with every breath he fought to take. The room that had briefly softened now felt enormous again. Hundreds of eyes stared at him from every direction. The bright white lights above seemed to grow hotter and harsher, burning into his skin and melting away the fragile calm Keanu had helped him build only moments earlier. Ethan's breath grew shallow, fast, uneven, as if his lungs refused to expand fully. His fingertips slipped against the strings, and the neck of the guitar wobbled in his trembling hands. He swallowed, but the lump in his throat refused to budge. Tears welled up again, blurring the edges of the stage, the judges' table, and the crowd. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a broken whisper escaped. I'm sorry." The apology cracked mid-sentence, echoing softly through the microphone. This time there was no laughter. The audience watched in stillness, recognizing the vulnerability in front of them. A few people in the front row shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to look away out of respect or stare because they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Ethan's shoulders curled inward again, collapsing beneath the weight of pressure and disappointment. Keanu took a small step closer, easily closing the space between them. His presence felt like a shield, blocking out the noise of the world, even as the room remained painfully silent. He didn't try to grab the guitar or take control of the moment. Instead, he positioned himself beside Ethan, close enough for Ethan to feel grounded, steady, and not alone. "It's okay," Keanu said softly, the warmth in his voice settling gently through the air. "Take your time." But Ethan couldn't. The fear inside him was spreading too quickly. He blinked hard, trying to clear his vision, trying to steady his breaths, trying to remember the first line of the song he had practiced hundreds of times in the small room behind the laundromat. But his mind was blank. The words were gone, swallowed by panic. A wave of shame hit him stronger than anything he had felt before. "I can't," he whispered, voice breaking. "I can't do this." The sound of those words hung heavy across the studio, wrapping everything in a thick, uneasy silence. Behind the judges' table, three faces shifted from confusion to helplessness, unsure whether to intervene or wait. The entire audience leaned in, holding their breath, sensing the moment teetering between collapse and something else entirely. And Keanu, watching Ethan struggle, gave him a small, reassuring smile, one that said, without needing any words at all, "We can still save this." Ethan's breathing grew sharper as the panic took full control. He clutched the guitar so tightly his knuckles turned white, but the instrument still felt like it might slip from his hands. He couldn't stabilize his fingers on the strings. He couldn't steady his voice. His chest rose and fell too quickly, each breath shallow and painful. The audience sat perfectly still, sensing that he wasn't just nervous. He was overwhelmed, drowning in the moment, and the cameras continued capturing every second with unforgiving clarity. Ethan tried to inhale deeper, but the sound that left him came out choked, almost a sob. His vision blurred further, and a fresh wave of tears spilled down his cheeks. He shook his head as if trying to shake loose the fear gripping him. But the pressure in the studio only intensified. He could feel the judges watching him. He could feel the heat of the lights burning down on him. He could feel the weight of 1,000 expectations he could never live up to. His legs trembled unsteady beneath him, and the guitar strap dug into his shoulder. He opened his mouth once more, desperately trying to start the song, but nothing came out. Not a whisper, not a hum, nothing. His voice had abandoned him completely. "I'm sorry," Ethan repeated, more broken than before. This time, the apology wasn't just for the judges or the audience. It was for his mother, for himself, for every moment he had hoped he could rise above his circumstances. He wiped at his face with the back of his hand, but the tears kept coming unstoppable. His breath hitched again, loud enough for the nearest microphone to catch. The sound pierced through the silence, making the moment even more painful to witness. Keanu stepped closer without hesitation. He didn't rush. He didn't overwhelm Ethan. He moved with the same calm, steady presence he had shown from the start. Standing just inches away, he angled himself slightly toward Ethan, blocking the crowd's full view, creating a small shield of privacy in the most public place possible. His voice came low, warm, and steady. "Hey," he murmured, "you're okay." Those two words softened the air like warm light breaking through clouds. Ethan's shoulders loosened slightly, though the panic still lingered in his eyes. Keanu's presence felt protective, grounding him without taking away his agency. He didn't try to take the guitar. He didn't try to force Ethan forward. He simply stood with him as the boy trembled on the edge of collapse. And in that vulnerable, fragile moment, something in the room shifted again, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably real. The judges exchanged looks that held more emotion than words could cover. The woman who had earlier suggested Ethan come back next year now pressed a hand to her chest, clearly moved. The sternest judge who had sighed loudly before no longer carried even a hint of irritation. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, watching Ethan with a softened expression, as though trying to understand how someone so young could carry so much weight alone. Even the third judge, known for being brutally honest, seemed caught between concern and admiration. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to help. All they could do was wait, suspended in the quiet tension of a moment that refused to follow the rules of television. The audience leaned in unconsciously, drawn to the fragile humanity unfolding before them. The earlier mockery was gone, replaced with empathy, guilt, and a deep curiosity about what would happen next. Ethan's breakdown wasn't a spectacle anymore. It was a reminder of what fear could do, how easily a dream could crumble under too much pressure. People who had laughed minutes earlier now sat with their hands clasped, their breaths held, wishing silently for him to find the strength to continue. But strength wasn't returning. Not yet. Ethan's voice trembled as he tried again. I can't do this." The words broke apart on the microphone, small and raw. His shoulders sagged in defeat. His head dropped, his hair falling forward as if he were trying to hide from the world. The guitar slipped slightly in his grip, and he caught it clumsily, embarrassed even by that. Ethan wasn't fighting a lack of talent. He was fighting the crushing weight of grief, fear, and the belief that he didn't deserve to be here. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He didn't let a second pass before his expression shifted. Not dramatic, not heroic, but certain. He tilted his head gently, studying Ethan's face, and offered a small, warm smile that radiated reassurance. A smile that said everything without speaking a single word. A smile that carried calm into the storm of Ethan's panic. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy, it was belief. In that silent exchange, Keanu told him, "We can still save this." And for the first time since the string snapped, Ethan felt a flicker of something deep inside his chest, something small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. Hope. The silence in the studio grew dense enough to feel like a physical weight pressing into Ethan's chest. He stared helplessly at the guitar, still unable to steady his breath, still trapped in the fear that had swallowed every word he once knew by heart. Keanu watched him for a long moment, not with frustration or pity, but with a calm understanding that seemed to steady the air around them. Then Keanu stepped forward, slow and deliberate, turning his body slightly toward the microphone. His movements didn't carry an ounce of theatrics. There was no dramatic gesture, no attempt to create a show-stopping moment. Everything about him remained gentle, thoughtful, grounded. He lowered his voice as he leaned just enough toward the microphone for it to carry through the room. "If you want," he said softly, "I can sing that song with you." The words were so unexpected, so impossible, that the entire studio froze in an instant. It was as though someone had hit a pause button on the world. One judge's jaw literally dropped open, her mouth forming a silent gasp she didn't bother to hide. Another judge blinked rapidly, unsure if he had heard correctly. A loud inhale echoed from somewhere in the crowd, sharp and stunned. A few people clapped a hand over their mouths. Others looked at each other in disbelief. Keanu Reeves, the man known for humility action roles and quiet kindness, had just volunteered to sing live on national television. Behind the scenes, several producers scrambled toward their monitors, bumping into each other as they tried to process the breaking of every rule they had planned for the finale. A couple of them whispered frantically into their headsets, asking if this was real, if they should stop it, or if they should let the moment unfold, but no one dared interrupt. Even they could feel the gravity of what was happening. Ethan's eyes widened, his breath catching painfully in his throat. He stared at Keanu as if trying to determine whether he had imagined those words. His mind raced, unable to hold on to a single clear thought. Keanu saw the confusion and offered a soft, reassuring smile, the kind that dissolved fear without force. "Only if you want," he added, gently placing the choice entirely in Ethan's hands. Ethan blinked, trembling, overwhelmed, and after a long, fragile breath, he nodded. The moment Ethan nodded, something shifted in the atmosphere so profoundly that even the cameras seemed to hesitate before moving again. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't accompanied by cheers or applause. Instead, the change settled quietly across the room, like the soft turning of a page after a long and painful chapter. People looked at one another with expressions that blended disbelief and awe, realizing they were witnessing something they would likely never see again on live television. Even the stage crew, seasoned professionals who had seen breakdowns, triumphs, and countless unexpected moments, stood frozen in place. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight, but the nod had come from a deep place inside him, a place that remembered why he came, why he fought to be here, why he endured every hardship leading up to this moment. Keanu's offer didn't erase his fear, but it softened, it shifted, it turned it into something he could face instead of something that suffocated him. His hands were still trembling, but they no longer felt glued to the guitar. His breathing was still uneven, but it no longer felt impossible. He lifted his gaze to Keanu, searching for confirmation that he had truly heard what he thought he heard. Keanu gave him that confirmation immediately. A small nod, a patient smile, a look that didn't push, didn't pressure, didn't expect. It simply supported. The audience leaned in, sensing a fragile moment, balancing between courage and collapse. People who had arrived expecting a polished talent show now found themselves watching an entirely different story unfold. It wasn't about fame anymore. It wasn't about ratings or musical perfection. It was about a young man who had been knocked down repeatedly and someone stepping beside him so he didn't have to stand alone. In the production booth, Michael Torres pressed a hand against his mouth, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. He had dreamed of a show that honored real, raw human stories. What he was seeing now was more powerful than anything he could have scripted. And when Keanu gently shifted his stance toward Ethan, silently signaling that he was ready, whenever Ethan was, every person in the studio understood they were witnessing the beginning of something unforgettable. Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, still shaking but no longer drowning. Something in Keanu's calm presence anchored him, holding him steady when his own strength faltered. The spare guitar felt lighter in his hands now, not because the fear was gone, but because someone was sharing the moment with him. The silence in the room stretched gentle and expectant, giving Ethan space instead of pressure. His breathing hitched once more, but it didn't break him this time. He held on to the sound, letting it settle inside him as he gathered what little courage he had left. Keanu took one slow step closer, careful not to invade, careful not to overshadow. He angled himself just enough so Ethan could see him clearly, as if to say he wasn't going anywhere. The audience remained completely still, waiting for the moment to unfold, knowing instinctively not to interrupt what had become a deeply human exchange. Ethan finally drew in a breath that felt fuller, steadier. He glanced at Keanu, searching for reassurance one last time. Keanu returned a soft nod, offering a warmth that reached Ethan's trembling heart. With that, Ethan exhaled and whispered the smallest, most determined answer he could manage. Okay. The studio lights dimmed slowly, sliding the room into a softer glow that settled like a blanket over the tense air. The bright, unforgiving beams that had earlier amplified Ethan's panic now faded into something gentler, more forgiving, almost intimate. The shift was subtle, but the entire audience felt it. The backup band, caught completely off guard by what was unfolding, hesitated with their instruments raised but unmoving. They exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether they should begin playing, unsure whether this unprecedented moment required their sound or complete silence. No one wanted to misstep. No one wanted to interrupt. Keanu took a quiet breath and looked toward the band's guitarist, a man in his 40s who was staring back with wide, disbelieving eyes. With a small, steady nod, Keanu signaled the key. The guitarist blinked once, then returned the nod, understanding instinctively that this wasn't a performance. It was a lifeline being offered to a trembling 19-year-old whose dream had been on the edge of shattering. He played a single soft chord, letting it ring through the dimmed studio. Then Keanu stepped toward the microphone. The room held still. Every camera, every crew member, every audience member seemed to freeze in place. No one wanted to miss a second of what might happen next. When Keanu began to sing the first low notes of Let It Be, the sound was soft and warm, carrying a gravelly sincerity that surprised everyone. His voice didn't have the polish of a trained professional, but it didn't need it. There was honesty in every note, a grounding calm that wrapped around the room and settled in the chest of every person listening. It wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. Ethan watched Keanu in awe, the world narrowing down to the quiet harmony beginning to take shape. As the low melody settled into the air, Ethan felt something inside him unlock, a loosening of fear. a crack of light breaking through his panic. He lifted the guitar slightly, fingers trembling but no longer frozen, and with a fragile breath he prepared to join the song beside the man who had chosen not to let him fall. Ethan's first note barely made it past his lips. It came out thin, shaky, almost ghost-like, as if his voice were testing the air to see if it was finally safe to exist again. His breath trembled. His fingers slipped once against the guitar strings, producing a soft scrape instead of a clean tone. But Keanu didn't stop singing. He didn't glance at Ethan with concern or pressure. He kept his eyes gently forward, voice steady, tone grounded, giving Ethan a moment to catch the rhythm at his own pace. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ethan's voice steadied. He took a breath that didn't hurt. Then another. He lifted his chin slightly, not in confidence, but in fragile hope. The next note he released was clearer, still soft, but carrying a thread of determination. His pitch blended into the space above Keanu's low melody, rising gently like a bird finding the wind after nearly crashing. The harmony that formed between them was unexpected. Keanu's deep, warm tone served as a foundation, steady and calm, while Ethan's higher voice, raw with emotion, floated above it. The contrast was imperfect. It was unpolished, but it was powerful. The audience leaned forward as if drawn by an invisible pull. The room seemed to shrink around the two of them, every eye locked on a moment that felt far too intimate and fragile for a televised show. The band members exchanged glances, recognizing that something rare was happening, something that didn't need embellishment or additional instrumentation. They softened their own playing, letting the two voices guide the moment. Ethan's hands still shook, but the tremble didn't stop him. His fingers found their place on the fretboard, and he strummed softly, falling into rhythm with Keanu's steady voice. Every note he played felt like reclaiming ground he had thought he lost forever when the string snapped earlier. Bit by bit, Ethan stepped into the song, his voice rising just enough to blend with Keanu's without overshadowing it. That fragile, imperfect harmony echoed through the dimmed studio, and the audience held its breath because everyone sensed something extraordinary unfolding right before their eyes. As the harmony grew stronger, the studio changed in a way no lighting cue or stage effect could ever create. The air felt warmer, softer, almost sacred. Ethan's voice, once barely audible, now carried a quiet courage. Each note he released made his shoulders lift a little higher, his breaths deepen, his hands steady against the guitar. Keanu continued to anchor the moment with his low, honest tone, never overpowering, never leading for attention. He sang beside Ethan, not above him, creating a space where the young singer could rise without fear. The audience watched in awe, frozen in the emotional gravity of what they were hearing. A few people pressed their hands to their mouths. Some wiped at the corners of their eyes. The judges sat in speechless stillness, no longer thinking about scores or critiques, only about the raw humanity unfolding before them. Even the producers, usually obsessed with ratings, leaned closer to their screens, forgetting the chaos in their headsets. Ethan's voice wavered once, then steadied again, as Keanu met his eyes with a soft nod mid-song. That small gesture ignited something deep in Ethan's chest. For the first time that night, he wasn't singing through fear. He was singing through hope. As the song continued, a shift swept through the studio so quietly and so deeply that no one could ignore it. The harsh, buzzing energy of earlier was gone. In its place settled something gentler, warmer, and more human than anything the show had produced all season. The audience members who had laughed at Ethan's broken string now sat motionless, their expressions softening as if they were seeing him for the first time. The power of the moment reached them long before they could fully understand why. It wasn't just the music, it wasn't just the harmony, it was the unmistakable feeling that something real and deeply emotional was unfolding in front of them, something rare enough to silence even the most restless hearts. The judges leaned forward, elbows on the table, their eyes glistening. One of them pressed a hand over her mouth, trying to steady the rise of emotion that caught her off guard. Another blinked rapidly, swallowing hard, as if holding back tears. They weren't watching a performance anymore. They were witnessing a moment of courage, taking shape right before their eyes. Ethan's voice, once faint and wrapped in fear, now carried a trembling strength that grew with each passing line. He wasn't singing perfectly. He didn't need to. The authenticity of his voice filled the studio far more powerfully than flawless technique ever could. Crew members who usually rushed between cameras and cables slowed down instinctively. It felt wrong to move too quickly, wrong to break the fragile beauty forming on the stage. Cameramen steadied their frames with careful precision, capturing every tremble of Ethan's breath, every soft cue from Keanu, every shared glance that anchored the young singer when he began to falter. Even the blinking red recording lights seemed softer somehow, as if honoring the moment unfolding beneath them. In the control booth, producers who normally obsessed over timing and ratings forgot to look at their monitors for a few seconds. Their headsets crackled unanswered as they watched the two voices blend on stage. Something extraordinary was happening, something no amount of planning could have created. And for the first time since Ethan stepped out under the harsh lights, the studio held its breath in reverence instead of judgment. Ethan's voice grew steadier with every measure of the song, supported by the quiet power of Keanu's presence. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic spotlight on Keanu. He didn't try to outshine the boy or take over the performance. He simply stood beside him, singing softly with a warmth that fused strength and gentleness. Whenever Ethan wavered, Keanu offered a subtle nod or a small glance of reassurance, enough to guide him without taking the moment away. Each cue worked like a steadying hand on Ethan's heart, pulling him back from panic and closer to the music he loved. The audience felt the transformation as it unfolded. People who had come expecting polished entertainment now found themselves wiping tears from their eyes. A woman in the second row clasped her hands together, swaying slightly with the melody. A man who had laughed earlier now stared at the stage with regret written plainly across his face. The entire room seemed to lean forward as if pulled toward the fragile courage Ethan displayed with each note. The sound wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. What mattered was the vulnerability behind every breath and the quiet bravery it took for Ethan to keep singing. Even the studio's environment seemed to respond. The lights held a soft amber glow, wrapping the scene in a warm, almost sacred atmosphere. The band played with a tenderness rarely heard in live television, following Ethan's pace instead of trying to impose their own. The cameramen captured close-up shots of Ethan's trembling lip, the tears still clinging to his lashes, and the determination slowly rising behind his eyes. They also caught Keanu's expression, steady, gentle, and quietly proud. The contrast between Keanu's grounding presence and Ethan's regained confidence created a visual story even more powerful than the music itself. Then it happened. Ethan reached for a note higher than any he had attempted since the moment the string snapped. His chest tightened for a split second, fear threatening to pull him back down. But Keanu met his eyes and gave a nod so small the audience almost didn't see it. That was all Ethan needed. He inhaled, lifted his chin, and aimed for the note with everything he had. And when the sound left his throat clear, full, and trembling with raw emotion, the entire studio gasped. The note soared through the studio with a purity no one expected from a boy who had nearly collapsed minutes earlier. It wasn't flawless, but it was alive, shaped by heartbreak, courage, and the sudden belief that he finally belonged on the stage he had feared moments before. Ethan held the note longer than he thought he could, his chest expanding with a strength he didn't know he had. When it finally faded into the soft echo of the band, a stunned silence followed, as if the entire room needed a moment to absorb what they had just heard. Then something almost unheard of in live talent shows happened. The audience began to applaud mid-song. It started softly, like a ripple, then grew into a warm, swelling wave of support. People clapped not for perfection, but for bravery. For a boy who had fought through fear and humiliation and continued to sing, Ethan blinked in shock, overwhelmed, but Keanu steadied him with a proud nod that felt like handing him a piece of strength. The applause faded back into quiet as they continued the song, but the room was forever changed. The same crowd that had mocked Ethan now lifted him with the purest gratitude, and Ethan kept singing, no longer afraid, no longer alone. The final chorus began with a gentle swell from the band, but the true shift came from Ethan. Something inside him opened fully like a door he had been afraid to touch until now. The tremble in his voice, the fear in his posture, the panic that had wrapped itself around his throat. All of it loosened as he stepped into the final chorus with a strength that surprised even him. His voice rose with a raw clarity, carrying the weight of every hardship he had endured, every lonely night, practicing behind the laundromat, every moment he doubted he belonged anywhere near a stage. The microphone captured the fragile grit in his tone, the way his breath hitched slightly before each line, but instead of sounding weak, it sounded undeniably human. Keanu sang beneath him, his low harmony, steady and warm, not competing but supporting. He carried the foundation of the moment, grounding the performance with a humility that made the harmony richer. When Ethan's voice cracked on one of the lines, not from fear now, but from sheer emotional overflow, it became one of the most beautiful moments of the night. The crack wasn't a flaw, it was truth, and the studio reacted instinctively with a soft murmur of awe. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the crowd, feeling the acceptance radiating back at him like a rising tide of warmth. Each note he sang felt like reclaiming a piece of himself he thought was lost forever. He moved into the final lines with a confidence that came from somewhere deep inside a place, shaped by loss but strengthened by hope. The air vibrated with emotion as he held on to the last phrase with everything he had. Keanu heard the rise in Ethan's voice and stepped back, not physically far, but enough to shift the emotional spotlight entirely onto him. This was Ethan's moment, Ethan's song, Ethan's rebirth in front of the very people who had doubted him. And when the last note finally drifted into silence, it felt like the whole world inhaled at once, stunned by the transformation they had just witnessed. The final note lingered in the air like a held breath, fragile and bright, stretching across the silent studio until it dissolved into the soft hum of the lights overhead. For a single suspended heartbeat, no one moved. The judges remained frozen hands, covering their mouths, eyes wide with disbelief. The audience sat forward in their seats, stunned by the sheer force of emotion that had filled the room. Ethan lowered his shoulders slowly, almost afraid that if he moved too quickly, the moment would vanish. His fingers loosened around the guitar, and the adrenaline that had carried him through the last chorus softened into a trembling relief. Then, like a spark igniting dry grass, one person stood. A woman in the third row rose to her feet, tears shining on her cheeks. A second person joined her, then a third. And suddenly the entire studio surged upward in a wave of applause so powerful it felt physical. The sound rolled across the room, growing louder with every passing second. People clapped with open palms, some cheering, some crying, some unable to fully express what they had just witnessed. A standing ovation wasn't just given, it erupted, spontaneous, emotional, unstoppable. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His chest tightened, but this time from something completely different. The applause wasn't mocking. It wasn't polite. It wasn't a courtesy. It was gratitude. It was recognition. It was the world telling him that after everything he had endured, after every doubt he carried on his back, he had finally stepped into the light with a voice that was uniquely and undeniably his. His eyes filled instantly, and tears spilled over, warm and uncontrolled. Keanu watched him with a soft smile, pride shining quietly through his expression. He didn't bow. He didn't gesture to the audience. He didn't try to take even a shred of attention. Instead, he lifted one hand and placed it gently over his chest, acknowledging Ethan's courage with a gesture that spoke louder than applause. Then he stepped back, surrendering the entire spotlight to the young man who had earned it with every trembling breath. Ethan stood alone in the center of the stage, the applause crashing around him like a warm, unstoppable wave. His tears fell freely now, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that he had done it. That the dream he once believed would die on this very stage had been reborn in front of thousands. His hands shook, but he didn't try to hide it. Every emotion he had fought to bury rose to the surface, and for the first time, he let the world see it. Keanu remained a few steps behind him, offering quiet support without stepping into the spotlight. His hand stayed over his heart, his eyes soft with pride. He didn't say a word, but he didn't need to. Ethan could feel the encouragement radiating from him like a steady light, reminding him that none of this was accidental. It was his moment, his voice, his triumph. The audience continued to rise higher in their applause, some cheering his name, others wiping tears from their eyes. The judges stood too shaken by the humanity of what they had just witnessed. And as Ethan looked out across the sea of standing figures, something inside him settled solid and whole. He wasn't just seen, he was believed in. The standing ovation slowly settled, but the emotion in the room did not. Even after the applause faded into a soft murmur, the studio remained wrapped in a warmth completely different from the tension that had filled it earlier. Ethan stood trembling still, clutching the guitar, his face streaked with tears he no longer tried to hide. The judges exchanged glances, silent, shaken, humbled. It took several seconds before any of them found the strength to speak. The judge, known for her strict, almost icy demeanor, was the first to stand. Her hands shook slightly as she brought the microphone closer. Her voice, usually sharp and controlled, cracked as she began to speak. "Ethan," she whispered, pausing to wipe a tear from the corner of her eye. "What happened on this stage tonight wasn't just a performance." She swallowed hard, overwhelmed. Keanu didn't just save a moment, he saved a dream. The audience murmured in agreement, several nodding, others wiping their eyes. Ethan stared at her, stunned, unable to process the words through the fog of emotion filling his chest. Another judge leaned forward, his expression soft and deeply apologetic. "I need to say something too," he said gently. "Earlier, I doubted you. I doubted your readiness, your confidence. I thought you were breaking." He shook his head slowly. "But you stood back up. You kept going even when the entire room felt impossible. That kind of courage. No one can teach that." Ethan's breath hitched again. He tried to say something, anything, but when he opened his mouth, only a small, broken sound escaped. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed, gripping the guitar as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. Keanu stepped forward, just enough so Ethan could sense his presence. Ethan turned slightly toward him, trying once more to speak. "Thank you. I don't even know how." But before he could finish, Keanu gently raised a hand, stopping him with a soft shake of his head. "This is his moment," Keanu said, simply turning toward the judges, refusing to take even a shred of credit. "He did this, not me." The judges exchanged another look, struck by the humility in Keanu's voice. For several long seconds, they simply watched him, the weight of his words settling across the entire studio. The audience felt it too. They understood that what had happened was bigger than talent, bigger than celebrity, bigger than the show itself. It was a moment rooted in kindness, courage, and the simple, powerful belief that someone deserved a chance. The third judge, usually the most blunt and unemotional, leaned toward her microphone next. She took a steady breath, struggling to regain her composure. "Ethan," she said softly, "we see so many performers come and go on this stage. Some have skill, some have charisma, some have confidence." She paused, her eyes glistening. "But very few show their heart the way you just did. And even fewer find the strength to stand back up after everything collapses around them." Ethan's tears spilled again, falling freely. He lowered his head, overwhelmed by the kindness he had never expected to receive on such a public stage. The judge continued, her tone firm but warm. "You reminded every person in this room what it means to fight for something you love, to stay even when it hurts, to keep going even when the world tells you you're not enough." She exhaled slowly. "Tonight you proved that you are more than enough." The audience erupted in soft applause, again moved by her words. Ethan tried to speak through the rising emotion in his chest, but his voice cracked. He steadied himself, gripping the guitar tighter, fighting to form a single, coherent sentence. I didn't want to let my mom down," he whispered. The judges' faces softened further, their eyes shining with fresh tears. Ethan's confession carried a heaviness that touched everyone in the room. Even the audience members who had laughed earlier now bowed their heads, wishing they could take back every unkind thought. Keanu remained beside Ethan, hands relaxed at his sides, letting the young man take every ounce of the moment he had earned. He didn't touch the microphone. He didn't step forward. He simply stayed close enough to remind Ethan that he wasn't alone. And finally, the lead judge lifted her microphone with renewed resolve. "Ethan," she said gently, "your journey doesn't end tonight." The entire room leaned forward, waiting for her next words. The lead judge placed both hands on the table, her voice steady despite the emotion clouding her eyes. "Ethan Marquez," she said with conviction, "this panel has reached a unanimous decision." The room held its breath. "You are going to the finale." The audience erupted with a warm, thunderous cheer that washed across the studio like a wave of redemption. People rose from their seats once more, applauding with genuine affection, this time not curiosity or shock. Ethan pressed a hand over his mouth, stunned the reality of the moment crashing over him with breathtaking force. His knees weakened, and for a second he looked as though he might collapse, but Keanu stepped just slightly closer, close enough for Ethan to draw strength from him without overshadowing the moment. One of the producers standing near the stage wiped his face, whispering to another crew member, "We could never script something this powerful." The other nodded in complete agreement, eyes still glued to Ethan. Ethan finally managed to lift the microphone with trembling hands. "Thank you," he whispered, voice breaking. "Thank you for believing in me." The judges smiled through tears. The audience roared its support. And Keanu, true to his word, kept every spotlight on the boy whose dream had just been restored. Backstage, the noise of the cheering crowd softened into a distant hum as Ethan was guided into a small waiting area lined with folding chairs and equipment cases. The adrenaline still surged through his body so powerfully that his hands wouldn't stop trembling. He sank into one of the metal chairs, clutching the guitar against his chest like it was the only solid thing in the world. His breaths came in short, shaky bursts, not from fear now, but from the overwhelming disbelief of what had just happened. His mind kept replaying the last few minutes, the standing ovation, the judge's words, Keanu's voice, blending with his. None of it felt real. It felt like a dream he might wake from at any moment. The curtain fluttered, and Keanu stepped inside quietly, without any fanfare or entourage. He walked over and lowered himself into a kneel beside Ethan, just as he had done earlier when he tuned the guitar. He placed a gentle hand on the edge of the chair. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you okay?" Ethan tried to answer, but emotions clogged his throat. He shook his head slightly, not as a no, but as an admission that he didn't even know how to describe what he was feeling. After a long moment, he managed a whisper. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything yet," Keanu replied, voice warm and steady. "Just breathe." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard as he tried to slow the tremble in his chest. After another moment of silence, he spoke again, this time with a voice still cracked but clearer. "I've been living alone since my mom died. I barely make rent. I didn't even think I deserved to be here tonight." His hands tightened around the guitar. "I almost didn't come. Thought I wasn't worthy of the stage." Keanu listened without interrupting his expression, softening with each word. There was no judgment in his eyes, only deep understanding. He didn't rush him. He didn't fill the silence. He simply offered Ethan the space to let the truth pour out. Truth he had carried alone for far too long. Ethan kept talking, the words spilling out faster than he intended, as if the performance had cracked open a part of him he had kept locked away for years. After she passed, everything got harder, he murmured. "I worked whatever jobs I could find, washed dishes, swept alleys behind restaurants, played on street corners for tips that barely covered food." His voice wavered as he looked down at the guitar resting across his knees. "This old thing was all I had left of her. She found it for me at a donation table. She always said the world needed to hear me." His fingers brushed the worn wood. "But when that string broke out there, it felt like the world was telling me she was wrong." Keanu nodded slowly, absorbing every word. His expression never shifted into pity. It stayed warm, grounded, and steady, the way someone looks when they truly understand, because they have lived through their own storms. Ethan finally lifted his eyes, searching his face. "I didn't think anyone would care," he whispered. "I didn't think I mattered enough." Keanu exhaled softly. "You matter," he said without hesitation. "More than you know." He leaned back slightly, resting his hands on one knee. "When I was starting out, I wasn't exactly the guy people believed in. I was awkward, quiet. People made fun of my voice, said my emotions were wrong. I didn't fit into any expected mold. But there were a few people, good people, who saw something in me when I couldn't see it myself." His gaze softened even further. "We don't get far alone. None of us." Ethan blinked, taken aback. He had never imagined that someone like Keanu Reeves, a man admired across the world, had once felt small, misunderstood, or out of place. "You," Ethan whispered. "People doubted you." Keanu gave a gentle smile. "More than you'd think." He tapped lightly on Ethan's guitar. "Talent isn't measured by money or confidence. It's measured by heart. And you've got more heart than half the people who walk onto that stage." Ethan's breath caught again, but this time from relief instead of fear. His shoulders loosened, and for the first time backstage, he allowed himself to truly believe the words being spoken to him. As Ethan absorbed Keanu's words, the backstage curtain shifted again. Michael Torres, the show's director, walked in with a look that carried both awe and urgency. He stopped a few feet away, taking in the sight of Ethan still trembling on the folding chair, and Keanu kneeling beside him like a guardian. Michael exhaled, visibly moved. "Ethan," he said gently, "I wanted to tell you this myself." Ethan straightened a little, wiping his face quickly. Did I mess up the show?" Michael shook his head firmly. "You gave us the most honest moment we've had in years." He hesitated, his voice thick with emotion. "We're airing your performance in full. No commercial break, no cuts, no edits. The moment deserves respect." Ethan stared at him stunned. "But shows don't do that. This one will," Michael said, "because of you." The weight of those words hit Ethan with overwhelming force. He covered his face with both hands, sobbing again, but this time the tears were soft, grateful, overflowing from a place he hadn't touched in years. Keanu rose slowly, placing a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder, letting him feel supported without taking a single bit of the moment away. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan felt not just seen, but valued. When the episode aired the following week, it didn't take long for the world to notice. From the very first notes, viewers watching at home felt the same shift that had swept through the studio. The full, uninterrupted clip opened with Ethan's trembling hands, the broken guitar string whipping across the stage, and the stunned silence that followed. Then came the moment everyone would replay endlessly, Keanu standing asking politely if he could borrow the stage and tuning the dusty spare guitar with the calm patience of someone who wasn't trying to create a moment, but trying to save a young man from breaking. People online were captivated immediately. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, the performance had been clipped, shared, reposted, and dissected across every major platform. The video of Ethan's shaky first notes blending into Keanu's warm, grounding voice spread like wildfire. Strangers who had never watched the show before clicked on the clip out of curiosity, but stayed because something about the moment felt profoundly human. It wasn't polished, it wasn't glamorous, it was vulnerable, raw, and unexpectedly healing. Millions of comments appeared within hours. Viewers wrote long messages about their own failures, the moments they froze under pressure, the people who lifted them back up when they couldn't do it alone. Some shared stories of losing parents just like Ethan. Others wrote about the first time someone believed in them when they felt invisible. The clip became more than entertainment. It became a symbol of second chances, of compassion in public spaces, of what could happen when a person reached out instead of stepping back. Ethan watched it all unfold from his tiny apartment, overwhelmed by the outpouring of kindness. Messages poured into his inbox from young musicians who had been told they weren't good enough, from teenagers struggling with stage fright, from adults who had carried grief for years without speaking it aloud. They thanked him for being brave. They thanked him for showing the world what fear looked like and what courage looked like too. And through it all, one question kept appearing beneath the clip: who helped him? Everyone knew, but no one could quite believe it had really been Keanu Reeves. As the clip continued to spread, journalists, bloggers, and television hosts scrambled to analyze every frame. They paused on the second Keanu stood up. They zoomed in on the way he tuned the guitar with gentle focus. They replayed the moment he placed a calming hand on Ethan's shoulder, grounding him when his breath had nearly collapsed. Articles were written about compassion, about unexpected mentors, about the beauty of quiet intervention. What struck people most was how unplanned it all seemed. There was no dramatic reveal, no scripted hero moment. Just a man recognizing someone in pain and choosing to step forward instead of looking away. Ethan's inbox became a flood of stories. A 17-year-old from Ohio wrote about freezing during her school choir solo and how she wished someone had stood beside her instead of laughing. A middle-aged father shared how he used to play guitar with his daughter before she passed away, and how hearing Ethan's voice cracked open memories he thought he had lost forever. A retired music teacher wrote that Ethan reminded her why she had dedicated her life to students in the first place. Ethan read every message slowly, often needing to stop and wipe his eyes. Meanwhile, Keanu avoided the spotlight as the world erupted around his act of kindness. Reporters swarmed him outside hotels, outside studios, even outside grocery stores, hoping to get a quote or a headline. Cameras flashed around him whenever he stepped outside. But Keanu simply lifted a hand, politely declining interviews with a calm shake of his head. When a persistent reporter finally caught him off guard near a parking lot, asking why he stepped in that night, Keanu offered the shortest answer possible. "I just saw someone who deserved a chance," he said. Then he walked away before anyone could press him further. That single sentence went viral on its own. People screenshotted it, posted it, made artwork around it, and shared it with captions about kindness, humility, and grace. It wasn't just the performance that inspired the world. It was the way Keanu refused to center himself even when millions tried to. His humility amplified the moment. It made the clip feel even more genuine, even more powerful. Ethan watched every reaction with disbelief. His story was no longer just about fear. It had become a message carried across the world, and the kindness that lifted him now lifted millions. As days passed, the clip didn't fade, it grew. Schools played it during morning assemblies. Counselors used it to talk to students about resilience. Music teachers shared it with classes as proof that heart mattered more than perfection. Even people far removed from the world of music found comfort in it. They watched Ethan stand on stage, terrified and trembling, then watched him rise again with someone quietly supporting him. And it reminded them of the moments when they too needed help but were afraid to ask. Ethan's follower count skyrocketed overnight, but the attention didn't inflate him. It humbled him. He wrote simple thank you messages when he could, and when the messages became too many to respond to, he posted a short note. "I'm just grateful you heard me." Those 6 words were shared almost as widely as the video. Meanwhile, Keanu stayed completely out of the spotlight. He didn't post about it. He didn't respond to praise. He didn't accept interviews, invitations, or tributes. His silence wasn't dismissive. It was intentional. He wanted every eye to land on Ethan, not on himself. And because of that quiet restraint, the moment became even more meaningful. Across the world, people agreed on one thing. A simple act of kindness had turned into something unforgettable. When finale night arrived, Ethan stepped onto the stage with a very different kind of trembling than before. His hands still shook, but this time it wasn't from fear that hollowed him out. It was from the weight of gratitude, the awareness that he had been given another chance, and the knowledge that he had earned his place here. The lights were just as bright as the night his string snapped. The audience was just as big. The pressure was just as intense. But Ethan wasn't the same boy who had walked out trembling, terrified, and convinced he wasn't worthy. He stood a little taller. He breathed a little deeper. and he held a brand new custom guitar that gleamed under the lights, a gift sent from a well-known music sponsor who had watched the viral clip and had been moved by Ethan's story. As the host introduced him, Ethan felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The nerves would never fully disappear, he knew that now. Anxiety wasn't something cured in a single night. But it didn't crush him anymore. It didn't whisper lies about worthlessness. It didn't make him want to run. Instead, it reminded him of everything he had survived. He lifted the guitar strap over his shoulder, felt the smooth, polished wood, and remembered Keanu's steady hand on his shoulder, the calm reassurance in his voice, and the quiet belief that had carried him through his darkest moment. The music began softly behind him. Ethan inhaled, held the breath for one steadying heartbeat, then began to sing. His voice wasn't flawless. It wasn't meant to be. It was honest, warm, shaped by grief and healing, and threaded with a resilience he had only recently discovered. The audience listened in stillness, not expecting perfection, but wanting to hear the heart he had shown the world. And when Ethan moved into the chorus, he felt something open inside him, an ease, danso, he had never experienced before. He wasn't singing to prove anything. He wasn't fighting the fear of failure. He was simply sharing a piece of himself with the world, knowing for the first time that he deserved to be heard. When Ethan finished the last note of his finale song, the reaction was immediate. The audience rose to their feet again, not with the shock of his first performance, but with the full-hearted admiration of people who had watched someone grow in real time. The applause swelled warm and steady, and Ethan bowed his head, overwhelmed but grounded. He didn't cry this time. Instead, he breathed through the emotion, letting it settle softly inside him, like a truth he finally believed. The judges offered glowing feedback, praising his courage, his emotional depth, and the sincerity that marked every note he sang. One judge said gently, "You showed us your heart again tonight, and that is something no competition can measure." Another added, "Whether you win or not, you've already changed lives." Their words didn't send Ethan spiraling like before. They didn't ignite panic or self-doubt. Instead, he felt something steady, rising in his chest, quiet confidence, the kind born from endurance rather than applause. When the results were announced, Ethan didn't win first place. The title went to a technically brilliant singer with years of training, and Ethan clapped for them with genuine happiness. He didn't feel defeated. He didn't feel overlooked. He felt grateful. Grateful to be on the stage at all. Grateful to have shared something real grateful, that the world had listened. After the show ended, his phone filled with emails and messages that made his head spin. Several music schools offered him scholarships, impressed not just by his talent, but by his resilience. Small concert venues reached out inviting him to perform intimate acoustic sets. A nonprofit organization asked him to sing at a charity event focused on youth mental health. The music sponsor who had gifted him the custom guitar followed up with an offer to help him record his first EP whenever he was ready. Each message felt surreal, like stepping into a life he had once only imagined from the far side of hardship. But this time, the opportunities didn't scare him. They inspired him. He realized something important. The finale stage wasn't the end of his journey. It was the beginning. And every path ahead felt brighter than anything he had allowed himself to hope for. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's life began to reshape itself in ways he never expected. His days were filled with rehearsals, meetings, and small performances at community centers and charity events. Each time he stepped onto a stage, the nerves still fluttered in his chest, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, they reminded him of how far he had come. He spoke openly about fear, about grief, about the night his guitar strings snapped, and he thought his dream had ended. And everywhere he went, people listened with a depth that surprised him. They didn't see a boy who had once faltered. They saw someone who had risen, someone who had been lifted, and who now lifted others. His favorite events were the small ones: libraries, youth shelters, recovery centers, places filled with people who understood loneliness, pressure, and loss. After each performance, teenagers approached him with shaky voices, thanking him for giving them the courage to try again. Some carried their own battered instruments. Others carried stories they had never spoken aloud. Ethan made time for all of them, knowing exactly how it felt to believe your voice didn't matter. Meanwhile, Keanu kept his distance, not out of coldness but out of respect. He watched a few of Ethan's performances online, smiling quietly at the boy's growing confidence. He never mentioned it. He never reached out for attention or gratitude. Whenever reporters tried to drag him back into the spotlight of Ethan's success, he simply redirected them. "This is Ethan's journey," he would say. "I'm just glad I was there when he needed a moment." He attended one of Ethan's charity performances anonymously, standing in the back of a dimly lit community auditorium. He watched Ethan sing with a steadiness he had never shown before, sharing his story with a room full of people who needed it. Keanu didn't approach him afterward. He slipped out quietly, leaving the applause to belong entirely to Ethan. And Ethan, without even knowing Keanu had been there, continued to grow into his own light, because Keanu had never intended to become the star of the story. He had only intended to lift someone else's. When the finale wrapped and the crowds slowly drifted out of the building, Keanu stepped through a side exit of the studio with his hands tucked into his pockets. The cool night air wrapped around him, quiet and steady, after the roar of applause that had carried Ethan through his final performance. Keanu paused beneath a dim street lamp, listening to the fading echoes inside the arena, letting the moment settle. He wasn't thinking about the cheers or the cameras. He wasn't thinking about the headlines that would surely try to drag him into the spotlight again. His thoughts were somewhere else, entirely focused on a single truth he had learned throughout his life. Some lives are changed by grand gestures, but most are changed by small, ordinary moments of kindness. Moments that pass quickly unnoticed by the world, but that stay in a person's heart forever. He took a slow breath, remembering the way Ethan's voice had cracked on that first night. How close the kid had come to letting fear swallow the last piece of hope he had left. Keanu knew that feeling all too well. He had lived through seasons where dreams seemed to crumble just as they were within reach. He had endured losses that made the world feel dimmer and colder, and he had been saved more than once by someone who simply believed he deserved another chance. That memory weighed gently in his chest now as he walked down the quiet sidewalk. What struck him most was how fragile turning points could be. Ethan's guitar string had snapped at the worst possible moment, and yet that moment had become the doorway to everything that came after. A broken string, a trembling apology, a room full of strangers prepared to laugh. It could have ended right there. Ethan could have walked off the stage and never played again. But something inside him had chosen to stay even while shaking. And Keanu had seen that spark. Not the performance, not the skill, but the heart. And sometimes heart was all someone needed to rebuild what fear tried to destroy. Keanu continued down the sidewalk, passing the back entrance where staff members were loading equipment into trucks. He kept his head low, avoiding attention, not wanting anyone to pull him into the noise of celebration. The moment inside the studio wasn't about him, and he wanted it to stay that way. Ethan was probably still backstage, surrounded by producers and show staff, hearing for the first time in his life that he mattered, that his voice meant something. Keanu smiled softly at the thought. He hoped the kid let those words sink in. He hoped he carried them into every room he stepped into from now on. As he walked, he found himself replaying the instant Ethan looked up at him after the final chorus. There had been fear in Ethan's eyes, but beneath that fear was something stronger. Determination. The kind that comes from a person who has survived too much to give up now. Keanu had seen that same expression in the mirror during the hardest seasons of his youth. Times when he questioned his place in the world, times when grief felt like a weight he didn't know how to carry. People had helped him then, sometimes with nothing more than a kind word or a gesture that told him he still belonged somewhere. That memory echoed inside him now, making the night feel heavier in meaning. He had not planned to stand up in the audience. He had not planned to walk onto the stage or tune a guitar or sing a song. But life rarely waits for plans. Sometimes, moments simply call out, asking a person to step forward because no one else is willing to. Ethan had been on the edge of breaking, and Keanu knew that if he turned away, the kid might spend the rest of his life believing he wasn't worth saving. Keanu paused beneath another street lamp, looking up at the deep blue sky. Small acts, he thought, were often the ones that changed everything, even if the world never knew their full story. Keanu took a slow breath as he continued down the quiet street, letting the cool night air settle his thoughts. The finale had ended hours ago, yet the weight of the moment still lingered with him, almost like a soft echo that refused to fade. He knew the world would talk about what happened. He knew the clip would circulate, analyzed from every angle, replayed for inspiration or curiosity. But he also knew that the heart of the moment belonged to Ethan alone. The courage to keep going wasn't something anyone could give him. It was something Ethan had reached for, even in fear, even when everything seemed set against him. As Keanu walked, he thought about how fragile dreams could be. They could be cracked by a few cruel laughs, bent by a moment of humiliation, or snapped entirely by a single failure. He understood that feeling well. He had lived through seasons when it felt like every door was locked and every voice around him said he didn't belong. And yet someone always stepped forward at the right moment. A teacher, a mentor, a friend, someone who believed in him before he learned how to believe in himself. Those memories were old, but their warmth never faded. He reached a small intersection where the traffic light flickered between red and green. No cars passed, no pedestrians walked by. It was the kind of stillness that made reflection easier. He stopped there, feeling the quiet press around him. Tonight wasn't about a song or a performance. It wasn't even about the show. It was about a boy who almost walked away from the one thing that connected him to the mother he lost. It was about a kid who needed someone to help him stand for just long enough to find his voice again. Keanu shifted his hands in his pockets and let a faint smile cross his face. Ethan would go on to sing in the finale. He would step onto that stage with the knowledge that he had worth, that he earned his place. Maybe he'd win, maybe he wouldn't, but the victory was already written inside him. He reclaimed the part of himself that fear tried to bury. That was the real ending. That was the part Keanu hoped the world would understand. He took a few more steps before the final thought settled in his mind with gentle clarity. A broken moment is not a finished dream. People fall, people fail, people tremble under the weight of doubt. But hope can be handed down, strength can be shared, and sometimes all it takes is one quiet act of kindness to rebuild what fear tried to destroy. He walked on, letting the message rest in the air behind him, like a soft footprint for anyone who needed it. Has anyone ever stepped in to help you when you were at your lowest? What story would you like to see Keanu Reeves in next?